Parable number 4. The scholar who owned his library. On identification with the adapted function. Now, a scholar in a quiet provincial town built a library beside his house. The library grew. Each year he added a room. The first room held only the books of his trade, of which there were perhaps 2,200. The second room held the books he had been told he should read, but had not yet. The works he had bought at auction. The works his older colleagues had recommended, and the works he had cited without reading and had then felt obliged to acquire so that he might one day defend the citation. The third room held the books he had read so often that the spines had cracked. The fourth room held the books that had won prizes. The fifth held the books that had been suppressed. The sixth held the books in languages he could not read, but which he intended in his retirement to learn. By the 10th room, he was buying books faster than he could read them. By the 20th, he was building rooms onto rooms. The original house was lost in the middle of the structure, like a small dry seed inside a great fruit. He had to walk through 6 rooms just to reach his own kitchen. He had to walk through 8 just to reach his own bedroom. The corridors between the rooms had grown so narrow in places that he could no longer pass with his coat on. Now, his wife had stopped in the second decade asking him to dinner. She had cooked his meals in the first decade and brought them to him in the third or fourth or fifth room, depending on where she had found him reading. She had stopped because he had stopped noticing. She had begun in the second decade to eat alone in the kitchen. He did not, when he discovered this, particularly object. He had been engrossed. He had assumed that she was content with the arrangement, and he hadn't asked. He slept among the spines. He ate them. When he ate among them. He ate. When he ate among them. He spoke to his wife through them. She would call him from the kitchen, and he would answer from 3 rooms away without looking up. His answers were increasingly sounds, just rather than words. A grunt that meant yes, a grunt that meant not now, a grunt that meant vaguely, I have heard you. She had learned to read his grunts. She had also in time stopped requiring answers. One evening in his 53rd year, his wife called him by his first name. He did not recognize it. He stood very still in the middle of the 23rd room, turning a page he had not been reading. He could not remember the name his wife had just used. He could not remember she had used it just now, or whether he had imagined the sound of it. He had not heard his first name spoken aloud in some years. The colleagues called him by his surname. The students called him Master. The wife had, in the first decade, called him by his first name, but in the second decade she had begun to call him only you. And in the third decade she had stopped calling him anything at all. The first name she had used he realized the name of the boy he had been before the first room had been built. He could not recall what that boy had been like. He could not recall what that boy had wanted. He could not recall whether that boy had wished to spend his life reading. The boy was, in some sense, the scholar's earliest acquisition. But the scholar had not opened the boy in many decades, and the boy, like many books on the higher shelves, had become unfindable. He went after a long while to the kitchen. He had to walk through 8 rooms to reach it. He passed the books he had read in his 30s, the books he had read in his 40s, the books he had purchased but never opened, the books in languages he had never learned, the books by men who had become his rivals, the books written by men who had become his friends, the books written by men who had then died, and he arrived in the kitchen. His wife was no longer there. The kitchen was dark. The stove had been cold for some time. He touched the iron, but it was cold not in the way a stove is cold between meals, but the way a stove is cold when it has not been lit in days. There was no food on the counters. There was no kettle on the hob. Kitchen had the quality of a room that had been recently abandoned. He sat down at the small kitchen table behind, and the library spoke to him from every room at once. You are the library now, it said. There is no man in the kitchen. The man went to the kitchen many years ago and you did not go with him. You stayed with us. We are, in some sense, what he became. We are also, in some sense, what he refused to become. He had wanted in his youth to be a man who could sit at a kitchen table with his wife. He had also wanted to be a man who knew all the books, but he could not be both. He chose us. We don't blame him. We have been good to him, but he is not any longer a man with a kitchen. He is a library with a kitchen attached. The kitchen has been abandoned because there was no one to use it. The wife has gone to her sister's. She has been gone for 3 weeks. You didn't even notice. And the scholar wept. He had not wept since he had been the boy his wife had called by the first name. He sat in the kitchen until very late. He didn't read. He had nothing in the kitchen to read. He sat at the small table in the dark with the cold stove behind him, and he tried to remember the boy. The boy did not fully come back. The boy was on a high shelf, and he could not, in his 53rd year, climb that high. His wife returned eventually from her sister's. She had not gone permanently. She had only needed, she said, 3 weeks of quiet. He did not, after her return, ask her where she had been. He sat with her in the kitchen sometimes in the evenings. He read less. He couldn't read no books at all, but he was, by then, too much of a library to do that. But he learned slowly to sit in the kitchen for an hour each evening and to call his wife by the name she had once called him, and to allow her to call him by the first name he had not heard in 20 years. The library was patient with this. The library understood in its great patience that even a library is, in the end, made of paper, and that paper in cold rooms, in the absence of a man, of a hand to turn it, eventually becomes dust. The scholar lived another 15 years. He died in the kitchen in a small library with his wife beside him, holding his hand. The library, when it was emptied by his children, contained 12,000 books, and they were sold at auction. They went to other libraries and other towns where other scholars added them to their own collections and built room onto rooms and forgot over decades the names of their own boys. The moral. The scholar who becomes the library has no kitchen and no name. He is read by what he thought he was reading. The library does not in the end blame him. The library is patient, but paper in cold rooms becomes dust. The work in the late evening is to walk back through the rooms to the kitchen while the kitchen is still warm enough to hold you.